Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving through the Midwest on my way to visit family. It was a long drive, and I needed a break, so I pulled into a rest area. It was one of those desolate places, just a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom, surrounded by flat, empty land. There were only a few other cars around, most of them parked far from each other. I got out, stretched my legs, and decided to use the restroom. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something odd. There was a truck parked off to the side, away from the other vehicles. The back of the truck was slightly open, and I thought I heard a faint noise coming from inside. It sounded like someone crying. I walked a little closer, trying not to be too obvious. The crying got louder, and I could make out words. It was a woman's voice, begging for help. My heart started pounding. I knew something was very wrong. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. I had to make a decision quickly. I couldn't just leave her there. I took a deep breath and approached the truck. As I got closer, I could see through the gap in the back. There was a woman inside, tied up and gagged. She looked terrified. I tried to open the door quietly, but it creaked loudly. The woman's eyes widened, and she started shaking her head, trying to warn me. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw 3 men walking towards me. They didn't look friendly. "What do you think you're doing?" one of them asked, his voice low and threatening. He was tall and muscular, with a scar running down his face. I tried to stay calm. I heard someone crying. I was just checking if everything was okay. The man with the scar stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Everything's fine. Mind your own business." I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave the woman. I took a step back, trying to think of a plan. The men must have sensed my hesitation because they closed in on me, cutting off my escape route. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, raising my hands. "Just let the woman go, and I'll leave." The man with the scar laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "It's too late for that." Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing my arm. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. The other 2 men grabbed me, pinning my arms behind my back. I struggled, but it was no use. They dragged me to the truck and threw me inside with the woman. She was crying harder now, her eyes full of fear. The men shut the door, plunging us into darkness. I could hear them talking outside, their voices muffled. I turned to the woman, trying to untie her gag. "We're going to get out of here," I whispered, but I wasn't sure how. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. The knots were tight, but I managed to loosen them enough to pull the gag off. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're dangerous. We have to get out of here." I nodded, my heart pounding. I could hear the men outside, arguing about what to do with us. I knew we didn't have much time. I felt around in the darkness, looking for anything that could help us escape. My fingers brushed against a metal tool, maybe a tire iron. I grabbed it, hoping it would be enough. The door suddenly swung open, and the light blinded me for a moment. One of the men climbed in, his face twisted in anger. "Time to shut you up," he growled, reaching for the woman. I swung the tire iron with all my strength, hitting him in the side of the head. He stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her out of the truck. We ran towards my car, but the other two men were already coming after us. I could hear their footsteps pounding on the pavement, getting closer. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get the key into the lock. Finally, the door opened, and we both scrambled inside. I locked the doors and started the engine, my heart racing. The men reached the car just as I pulled away, pounding on the windows and shouting. I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the rest area. My mind was in a blur as I drove, trying to put as much distance between us and them as possible. The woman was sobbing beside me, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you." We drove for what felt like hours, not daring to slow down. Eventually, we reached a small town and pulled into a gas station. I called the police and told them everything. They sent officers to the rest area, but by the time they got there, the men were gone. The woman told me her name was Emily. She had been kidnapped a few days earlier and didn't know where they were taking her. The police took our statements and promised to do everything they could to find the men. It was a long, terrifying night, but we were safe. I still have nightmares about what could have happened, but I'm grateful I stopped at that rest area. If I hadn't, Emily might still be out there, trapped in that truck. I was hauling a load through the remote areas of Montana. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the sun sets slow, painting the sky with reds and oranges. The road was empty, just me and my truck rumbling along. I had a long drive ahead, and the solitude was both calming and eerie. I saw him standing by the side of the road, thumb out, looking for a ride. He seemed harmless enough, young, scruffy, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about the emptiness of the road made me feel sorry for him. Maybe he was stranded. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just down the road a bit," he replied, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "Thanks for stopping." I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, and I pulled back onto the road. For a while, we made small talk. His name was Jake, and he was trying to get to the next town. He seemed friendly, if a little tired. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the truck shifted. I started noticing little things. The way his eyes darted around the cab, like he was casing the place. The way he shifted in his seat, his body tensing. My unease grew, but I tried to push it down. Maybe he was just nervous. Or maybe I was just imagining things. Then, out of nowhere, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife. My heart leapt into my throat. "Pull over," he said, his voice suddenly cold and hard. "Now!" My mind raced. I kept my hands on the wheel, trying to stay calm. "Look, if it's money you want, I've got some cash." I said, "Pull over," he shouted, pressing the knife against my side. I did as he said, my hands trembling on the wheel. The truck rolled to a stop on the side of the deserted road. He grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the cab, dragging me around to the passenger side. My mind was in a blur. I couldn't believe this was happening. "Get in," he ordered, shoving me into the passenger seat. He climbed into the driver's seat, still holding the knife. I watched as he fumbled with the gears, trying to figure out how to drive the truck. "You don't know how to drive this, do you?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glared at me. "Shut up and tell me how." I realized then that this was my chance. If he couldn't drive the truck, he needed me. I had to stay calm and think of a way out. "All right," I said slowly. "I'll show you. Just don't hurt me." He nodded, and I leaned over, pretending to help him with the gears. My mind was racing, looking for an opening. And then I saw it. The emergency brake. In one quick motion, I yanked the brake and shoved the door open, tumbling out onto the gravel. He shouted, lunging after me, but I was already scrambling to my feet. I ran, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him cursing, the sound of him stumbling out of the truck. I had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to get help. The road was empty, the surrounding field stretching out into darkness. I spotted a small stand of trees and sprinted towards it, praying he wouldn't see me. I crouched behind a tree, trying to catch my breath, listening for any sign of him. The night was silent, the only sound the blood pounding in my ears. I could hear him shouting, but his voice was getting fainter. Maybe he thought I'd run down the road. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, I dared to peek out from behind the tree. The road was empty. The truck was still there, but Jake was nowhere in sight. I had to get back to the truck. It was my only chance. I crept back towards it, every shadow making my heart race. When I reached the cab, I saw the knife lying on the seat. He must have dropped it in his panic. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and climbed back into the driver's seat. I started the engine, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. As I pulled back onto the road, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Jake was running towards the truck, his face twisted with rage. I floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward. He was gaining on me, his footsteps pounding on the gravel. I swerved, trying to shake him off, but he grabbed onto the side mirror, his fingers scrabbling for a hold. I swung the truck back and forth, finally managing to throw him off. He fell, rolling onto the road, and I sped away, my heart pounding. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. I pulled into a gas station and called the police, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. They found Jake a few hours later, wandering along the road, his face bruised and bloodied. They arrested him, and I had to give a statement. It was all a blur, my mind still reeling from the terror of it all. I'm still shaken by what happened. Every time I get behind the wheel, I can feel my heart start to race, the memory of that night still fresh in my mind. I'm just grateful I got out of there alive. It could have ended so much worse. I was driving through Texas on my way to deliver a load. It was late, around midnight, and the highway was mostly empty. The radio was playing low, just enough to keep me company. I've done this route 100 times, but that night, something felt off. I first noticed a truck in my rearview mirror. It was a big rig, lights blazing, coming up fast. I figured it was just another trucker trying to make good time, so I moved over to let him pass. But instead of passing, he stayed right on my tail, his high beams glaring into my mirrors, almost blinding me. I tried to wave him on, but he didn't budge. He just kept riding my bumper, way too close for comfort. My hands tightened on the wheel, nerves starting to get the best of me. What was this guy's problem? Finally, he swerved out into the passing lane, but instead of speeding up to pass me, he stayed right beside me, matching my speed. I glanced over and saw his cab, dark and menacing. I couldn't see the driver's face, just a silhouette. It gave me a bad feeling. Suddenly, he veered closer, edging into my lane, trying to push me off the road. I jerked the wheel to the right, my heart racing, trying to keep my truck steady. What the hell was he doing? My mind raced with questions. Was he drunk? Crazy? I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but he kept pace, his truck looming in my side mirror. He swerved again, this time harder, nearly forcing me onto the shoulder. Panic surged through me. I had to do something, or he'd run me off the road for sure. I saw a rest area sign up ahead and decided to make a break for it. Maybe if I pulled in, he'd just keep going. I signaled and started to exit, but he followed, his truck almost touching mine. I floored it, racing down the ramp and into the rest area parking lot. I stopped my truck and jumped out, heart pounding, looking for help. The place was deserted. I turned around and saw his truck blocking the exit, headlights off now, just sitting there like a predator watching its prey. I couldn't see the driver, but I knew he was in there, watching me. I ran to the payphone near the restrooms, fumbling for change, my hands shaking. I dialed 911, praying for an answer. The operator picked up, and I quickly explained what was happening, my words tumbling out in a rush. She told me to stay on the line and wait for the police. I looked back at the truck. It was still there, silent and menacing. Then the headlights came on, and the engine roared to life. He started moving, slowly rolling towards me. I felt a surge of terror. What if the police didn't get here in time? I ran back to my truck, locking the doors behind me, trying to think of what to do next. I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed a plan. I remembered there was another exit on the far side of the rest area, less obvious. Maybe I could make it out that way. I started my truck and slowly began to move, trying not to attract his attention. But he saw me. He gunned his engine and came straight at me. I swerved, narrowly missing him, and sped towards the far exit. My truck roared as I pushed it to the limit. I glanced in my mirrors. He was right behind me, getting closer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to shake him. Then I saw the police lights in the distance, flashing blue and red. Relief washed over me. I just had to hold on a little longer. I veered onto the highway, heading towards the police cars. The rogue trucker slowed, then stopped, realizing he was caught. The police surrounded him, guns drawn, shouting for him to get out of the truck. I pulled over, my whole body shaking with adrenaline. The police took my statement, and I watched as they hauled the trucker out of his cab, cuffing him. He looked wild-eyed and angry, but he was caught. I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. It was over. I got back in my truck, still trembling, and continued my journey. The road was quiet again, the danger passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night had changed something in me. I was driving through the Rockies during a snowstorm, trying to make it to my delivery spot before the weather got any worse. The snow was coming down heavy, and the roads were getting slick. It was late, and there were hardly any other vehicles on the road. Just me and my thoughts, the radio on low to keep me company. Suddenly, I saw a man on the side of the road, waving his arms. His car was parked haphazardly with the hood up. He looked desperate, and I couldn't just drive past him in this weather. I pulled over, rolled down my window, and asked if he needed help. He told me his car had broken down and he needed a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated for a moment but then unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, shaking the snow off his coat and thanking me profusely. He looked normal enough, middle-aged, a bit rough around the edges, but who wouldn't be in this weather? We started driving, and he made small talk, asking where I was headed and how long I'd been on the road. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I chalked it up to the stress of the storm and focused on the road ahead. After a few miles, his demeanor changed. He got quiet and started looking around the cab, almost like he was casing the place. My nerves were on edge, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me, grabbing the wheel and trying to steer us off the road. I fought back, wrestling for control of the truck. He was yelling something about needing my truck and how he couldn't let me ruin his plans. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't just a desperate man, he was dangerous. I managed to elbow him in the ribs, causing him to lose his grip on the wheel. I hit the brakes, skidding to a stop on the icy road. We were both breathing hard, and I knew I had only seconds before he tried something else. I reached for the door handle, but he was quicker, pulling a knife from his coat and pointing it at me. "Get out," he ordered, his voice cold and steady. "Now!" I raised my hands, trying to show I wasn't a threat, and slowly got out of the cab. The snow was falling harder, the wind whipping it into my face. He got out too, keeping the knife trained on me as he moved towards the driver's seat. As he climbed in, I saw my chance. I grabbed the door and slammed it on his leg, making him howl in pain and drop the knife. I kicked it away and yanked the door open, dragging him out and throwing him into the snow. He scrambled to get up, but I was already back in the truck, locking the doors. I started the engine and floored it, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, shouting and waving his arms, but I didn't slow down. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop now. I drove for what felt like hours, not daring to pull over or slow down. Eventually, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. Relief washed over me as I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights. I got out, shaking, and ran inside to call the police. The cops arrived quickly, and I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they'd search for the man. I stayed at the station for a while, trying to calm down and collect myself. The snowstorm was still raging outside, but I felt a little safer knowing I wasn't alone anymore. Eventually, I got back in my truck and continued my journey, the fear slowly fading but never completely gone. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering how close I had come to real danger. The snowstorm finally eased up, and the roads cleared as I made my way out of the mountains. I never saw the man again, and I don't know if the police ever caught him. But every time I drive through a storm now, I can't help but feel a twinge of fear, remembering that night in the Rockies. I was driving through Arizona late at night, the highway mostly empty. I'd been on the road for hours, and fatigue was hitting hard. I decided to stop at a truck stop to grab some coffee and stretch my legs. The place was dimly lit, with only a few other trucks parked around. As I got out of my truck, I noticed a couple of guys standing by a car off to the side. They seemed to be talking quietly, glancing around nervously. I didn't think much of it at first. Truck stops attract all kinds. I headed inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The clerk behind the counter gave me a nod. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat by the window. I watched the two men outside. One of them handed the other a small package. The other guy opened it, inspected it, then handed over a wad of cash. Something about the exchange felt off, but I figured it wasn't my business. I finished my coffee and was about to head back to my truck when I heard raised voices outside. The guy who had received the package was shouting, looking angry. The other guy looked scared, backing away with his hands up. I hesitated, not sure if I should get involved. Suddenly, the angry guy pulled out a gun. My heart skipped a beat. I ducked down behind the counter, peeking out to see what would happen. The clerk had also noticed and was frantically dialing the phone. The man with the gun demanded something, waving the weapon around. The scared guy reached into his pocket, pulling out another package. It looked like the deal had gone wrong. The angry guy snatched the package, still yelling, then glanced around and saw me watching from inside. Panic surged through me. He started towards the truck stop, gun in hand. I bolted for the back door, pushing it open and running out into the dark. I heard the door to the truck stop slam open behind me. I ran around the side of the building, hoping to circle back to my truck without being seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I crouched behind a stack of crates, peeking around the corner. The man with the gun was inside, yelling at the clerk. I took a deep breath and made a dash for my truck. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and jumping inside. I started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw the guy with the gun come running out of the truck stop. He spotted my truck and raised the gun, firing a couple of shots. I ducked down, hitting the gas and speeding out of there as fast as I could. I drove for what felt like forever, not daring to slow down. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I checked my nerves constantly, expecting to see headlights following me, but there was nothing. Eventually, I pulled over at a rest area, far from the truck stop. My hands were still shaking as I turned off the engine and sat there in the dark. I took deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I knew I should call the police, but I was scared. What if those guys had connections? What if they came after me? I decided to keep driving, putting as much distance between me and that truck stop as possible. I finally stopped at a motel, exhaustion catching up with me. I locked the door and pushed a chair under the doorknob for extra security. I barely slept, jumping at every little noise. The next morning, I turned on the news, but there was no mention of any incident at the truck stop. I wondered what had happened to the clerk, if he was okay. I felt guilty for running, but I didn't know what else to do. I continued my journey, constantly looking over my shoulder. The fear stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to danger. I never stopped at a truck stop again, preferring to take my chances on the open road. Every time I think back to that night, I get a chill down my spine. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it almost cost me my life. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts. I don't know what happened to those men, and I don't want to find out. I just hope that Clerk is safe and that nobody else got hurt. As for me, I keep driving, but I'm always on edge, always watching. The road can be a dangerous place, and sometimes you stumble into trouble without even trying. I was lucky to get out alive, and I don't take that for granted. I've learned to be more careful, to trust my gut. The memory of that night stays with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I'm grateful to be here to tell the story. I was transporting a high-value load across Florida, a shipment of electronics destined for a big retailer. The drive had been uneventful until I hit a stretch of highway just past Orlando. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I noticed a car trailing me, a beat-up old sedan. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, but as the miles ticked by, it stayed there, matching my speed, never passing. I tried to shake them off by switching lanes, but they stuck to me like glue. A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard stories about truck hijackings, but never thought it would happen to me. I picked up my CB radio and called out to see if any other truckers were nearby, but got no response. I decided to keep driving, hoping they'd lose interest. But then they started getting more aggressive, speeding up and getting dangerously close to my rear bumper. I could see the driver in my mirror, a man with a hard face and dark glasses, and a passenger who looked just as menacing. They pulled up beside me, and I glanced down to see the passenger waving a gun. Panic surged through me. I couldn't outrun them in my rig, and stopping wasn't an option. I needed a plan. I spotted a sign for a rest area a few miles ahead and decided to make a break for it. Maybe there'd be people around, safety in numbers. I hit the gas, pushing my truck as fast as it would go. The car swerved, trying to force me off the road, but I managed to keep control. My heart was pounding as I pulled into the rest area, my eyes scanning for any sign of help. There were a few cars and a couple of trucks, but not as many people as I'd hoped. I parked and jumped out of the cab, shouting for help. The few people around looked startled but didn't move. The sedan screeched to a halt behind me, and the two men got out, guns drawn. I backed up against my truck, my mind racing for an escape route. One of the men shouted at me to hand over the keys. I hesitated, and he fired a shot into the air. People started screaming and running. I threw the keys at them, hoping to buy some time. As they scrambled for the keys, I bolted toward the rest area building. I burst through the doors, panting and wild-eyed. A middle-aged man behind the counter looked up, alarmed. "Call the police." I yelled. "They're trying to hijack my truck." He grabbed the phone, but I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I ran through the building and out the back, heading for the wooded area beyond. I could hear the men shouting behind me, and another gunshot rang out. I plunged into the trees, branches whipping at my face. I stumbled and fell, but scrambled back to my feet, not daring to look back. My only thought was to get away, to hide. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I found a dense thicket and crawled inside, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their angry voices carrying through the trees. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound of footsteps. Finally, the voices faded. I stayed hidden, too scared to move. Darkness fell, and the temperature dropped. I was cold and shaking, both from fear and the chill in the air. Eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. I stayed put, afraid it might be a trick, but the sirens grew louder, and I knew it was the police. I slowly crawled out of my hiding spot and made my way back to the rest area, my legs trembling with each step. The rest area was lit up with flashing lights. Officers were talking to the few remaining witnesses, and my truck was still parked where I left it. I approached an officer, and he saw the state I was in and came over. "Are you the one who called?" he asked. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He led me to a squad car, where I gave my statement. They'd caught one of the men, but the other had fled. They assured me they'd find him, but it didn't ease my fear. The police stayed with me while I waited for a tow truck to take my rig. I couldn't stop shaking, the adrenaline finally wearing off. The officer told me I was lucky to be alive, and I knew he was right. As I drove away from the rest area, my rig now secured by a tow truck, I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting the sedan to come roaring back. It was a long time before I could drive without the knot of fear in my stomach. I made it to my destination and delivered the load, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything. I still drive, but I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings, always ready for the worst. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains late at night, hauling a load of timber to a mill a few states over. The winding roads and steep hills were challenging, but I had driven this route many times before. My rig was a beast, reliable and strong. I had the radio on low, trying to keep myself alert. Suddenly, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck was coming up fast behind me, way too fast for these narrow, twisting roads. I tried to keep my focus on the road ahead, but the truck got closer, its headlights blinding in my mirrors. The truck sped up and then swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling up beside me. I glanced over and saw a familiar face. It was Dave, a trucker I knew from a few jobs we had done together. We had a falling out over a job a year ago. He thought I had taken a contract he wanted, but it wasn't like that. He never let it go. Dave's rig veered towards mine, nudging me closer to the edge of the road. I honked and tried to move away, but there was nowhere to go. The guardrail was too close. I felt my truck lurch as he hit me again, harder this time. Panic set in. If I went off the road here, I could go down a steep embankment. I slammed on the brakes, hoping to let him pass, but he braked too, staying right beside me. I had no choice but to speed up, trying to find a stretch of road wide enough to maneuver. My heart was pounding, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. Ahead, I saw a turnoff, a dirt road leading into the forest. I took a chance and yanked the wheel to the right, my tires skidding as I left the asphalt. Dave followed, his truck bouncing on the rough terrain. The dirt road was narrow, branches scraping the sides of my rig. I hoped it would be too rough for Dave's truck, but he kept coming, relentless. The road twisted and turned, and I struggled to keep control. Trees loomed on either side, and there was no room for error. In my mirror, I saw Dave gaining on me. He rammed my truck again, harder this time, and I felt the rear wheels lose traction. I fought to keep the truck on the road, my heart in my throat. Then, I saw it clearing up ahead, an old logging site. I floored it, my truck bouncing and jolting over the uneven ground. I hoped there would be enough space to turn around or at least find some cover. The site was deserted, just piles of old logs and equipment rusting in the moonlight. I swerved behind a stack of logs, hoping to lose Dave, but he followed, his truck roaring like a beast. He rammed into me again, and I felt the truck shudder. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I had to find a way to stop him. I spotted an old logging crane, its massive arms still holding a log suspended in the air. An idea hit me. I steered towards the crane, praying it still worked. As I got closer, I jumped out of the cab, my feet hitting the ground hard. I ran to the crane and climbed into the operator's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the controls. Dave's truck barreled towards me, and I swung the crane's arm, the log swinging through the air. It hit the front of his truck with a deafening crash, the impact sending his truck skidding. He lost control, his rig slamming into a pile of logs. The sound was horrendous, metal and wood splintering and crashing. I sat there, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my ears. Dave's truck was a wreck, steam hissing from the engine. I climbed down from the crane and approached cautiously, not sure what to expect. Dave was slumped over the wheel, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He was alive but dazed. I pulled out my phone and called for help, my hands still trembling. The police arrived quickly, and I explained everything. They took Dave into custody, and I sat on the bumper of my truck, trying to calm down. The officer told me Dave had been on a rampage, blaming me for his problems. I knew he had been struggling, but I never thought it would come to this. As I watched them take him away, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I got back into my truck, my body aching from the tension. I still had a job to finish, but I knew I would never forget this night. The mountains were beautiful but unforgiving, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. I was driving through the vast deserts of Nevada, the sun already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue. The nearest town was still miles away, and the only signs of life were the occasional cacti and distant mountains. It was just me and the endless stretch of highway. I spotted a rest area up ahead, a small oasis in the middle of nowhere. Relieved, I pulled over, intending to stretch my legs and get a quick rest before continuing. The place was deserted, just a few empty trucks parked under the dim lights. I got out of my car and took a deep breath of the cool desert air. As I walked towards the restroom, I noticed a man standing by a truck, watching me. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He gave me a nod, and I nodded back, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me. I quickly used the restroom and splashed some water on my face. When I came out, the man was still there, leaning against his truck. He called out, "Hey, need any help? Trucking through here can be tough." I shook my head, trying to be polite but firm. "No, thanks. I'm good." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Joe. Been driving these roads for years. You sure you're all right?" "Yes, really. Just tired," I replied, starting to walk back to my car. Joe followed me, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Where are you headed?" I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to engage. "Just passing through." He kept pace with me, and I quickened my steps. "You should be careful out here. A lot of dangerous folks around." I reached my car and turned to face him. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for the warning." He took a step closer, invading my personal space. "You know, it gets pretty lonely out here. You sure you don't want some company?" My heart started pounding. "I'm fine, really. Please, leave me alone." Joe's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating look. "All right, suit yourself. But remember, it's a long way to the next town." I got into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking. I watched as Joe walked back to his truck, glancing over his shoulder at me. I waited until he was out of sight before starting the engine and pulling out of the rest area. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was no sign of Joe's truck. Still, I couldn't relax. The road ahead was dark and empty, and every shadow seemed to move. After a few miles, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another traveler, but the lights stayed with me, matching my speed. My anxiety spiked when I realized it was Joe's truck. He was following me. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put some distance between us. The truck sped up too, closing the gap. Panic set in, and I felt a cold sweat on my back. I had to find a way to lose him. Up ahead, I saw a dirt road branching off from the highway. Without thinking, I swerved onto it, my tires kicking up dust. The road was rough, and I had to slow down to avoid losing control. I hoped Joe wouldn't risk following me. But he did. His truck barreled down the dirt road, gaining on me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was enjoying this, the thrill of the chase. I needed to find a place to hide or get help, but there was nothing but desert and darkness. The road ended abruptly at an old, abandoned gas station. I had no choice but to stop. I jumped out of my car and ran towards the building, hoping to find a phone or a weapon, anything to defend myself. The door was unlocked, and I slipped inside, slamming it behind me. I could hear Joe's truck outside, the engine idling. I crouched behind the counter, trying to control my breathing. The place was dark, filled with shadows and the smell of decay. My heart pounded in my ears as I heard the crunch of gravel under Joe's boots. "Come on out," he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. I just wanted to talk. I stayed silent, hoping he would give up and leave. But his footsteps got closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I needed to find something to defend myself with. My hands fumbled in the dark, searching for anything. Then I found it, a rusty tire iron. I gripped it tightly, my only hope against Joe. I heard him at the door, his hand rattling the doorknob. He pushed it open, stepping inside. I held my breath, waiting for the right moment. Joe walked past me, his eyes scanning the room. I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. He was hunting me, and he wasn't going to stop until he found me. I knew I had to act fast. I stood up and swung the tire iron with all my strength. It connected with Joe's arm, and he cried out, dropping the knife. I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran. My only thought was to get away. I burst out of the gas station and sprinted to my car. Joe was behind me, yelling curses. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. Joe reached the car just as I hit the gas, and I felt a thud as he slammed his fists on the hood. I sped away, the headlights of Joe's truck shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't slow down until I reached the next town, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I parked in front of a diner and ran inside, asking the waitress to call the police. They found Joe's truck abandoned near the gas station, but he was gone. The police assured me they would search for him, but I knew I would never feel safe again. The vast deserts of Nevada had shown me how small and vulnerable I was, and I would never forget Joe's face or the terror I felt that night. I was driving through the Pacific Northwest at night, the road lit only by my headlights. It was a long stretch of highway, surrounded by dense forest. I had been on the road for hours, enjoying the solitude and the hum of the engine. I was heading to visit some old friends, needing a break from the routine of work and life. Around midnight, I saw her. A young woman, standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. She looked terrified. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window. She ran up to the car, her face pale and eyes wide. "Please, can you help me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I need to get away from here." I unlocked the door, and she climbed in quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. As I pulled back onto the highway, she kept looking behind us, her hands trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's a man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's after me. I escaped from him, but he's coming." My heart pounded. I didn't know what to say. I just kept driving, hoping to put some distance between us and whoever she was running from. She introduced herself as Sarah. She told me she had been staying at a nearby campground when she met this man. At first, he seemed friendly, but soon his behavior turned threatening. She managed to run away when he wasn't looking, but she was sure he would come after her. I drove faster, glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights behind us. The road was empty, but the tension in the car was thick. Sarah was still looking back, her fear palpable. "Do you think he'll find us?" I asked. "He always finds me," she replied, her voice hollow. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the tires on the road. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights in the mirror. They were far back, but they were there, growing closer. "Is that him?" I asked, my voice tight. Sarah turned to look and her face went white. "Yes," she whispered. "That's him." I pressed down on the gas pedal, my car speeding up. The headlights behind us grew brighter. My mind raced. What did this guy want? Why was he so determined to catch Sarah? I didn't have time to think. I just knew we had to get away. The car behind us got closer, almost blinding in the mirror. I swerved into the other lane, trying to keep ahead. Sarah was gripping the seat, her knuckles white. The other car swerved too, matching our speed. "He won't stop," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "He won't stop until he gets me." I needed a plan. Just driving faster wasn't going to work. I looked around, trying to find a way out. Up ahead, I saw a side road, barely visible in the dark. Without thinking, I veered off the highway and onto the narrow road. The car behind us followed. The side road was rough, full of twists and turns. Trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like claws. I drove as fast as I could, my car bouncing on the uneven ground. The other car was still behind us, getting closer. "Where does this road go?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we can't stop." The road got narrower, the trees closer. I could barely see. The other car's headlights were right behind us now, almost touching our bumper. I had to do something. Up ahead, I saw a clearing. I turned sharply, skidding into the open space. The other car followed, but I hit the brakes, spinning the wheel hard. My car turned, and the other car shot past us, missing by inches. I floored the gas pedal, driving back the way we came. The other car took a moment to stop and turn around. That gave us a few precious seconds. I sped back down the narrow road, branches scraping the sides of the car. In the mirror, I saw the other car struggling to catch up. "We need to hide," Sarah said, her voice urgent. I nodded, looking for a place to pull off. Up ahead, I saw a small trail leading into the forest. I turned sharply, the car bouncing over the rough ground. We drove a short distance into the trees, then I turned off the engine and lights. We sat in silence, listening. The other car roared past, not seeing where we had gone. We waited, the darkness around us thick and silent. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. Sarah was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't stay here," I whispered. "He'll come back." Sarah nodded, and we got out of the car, moving deeper into the forest. We stayed low, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every sound seemed magnified, every crack of a branch making us jump. We found a small hollow, hidden by thick bushes. We crouched there, listening. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. He was coming back. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find us. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. We could hear him breathing, just on the other side of the bushes. Sarah's hand was gripping mine, her nails digging into my skin. The footsteps moved on, getting fainter. We stayed where we were, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, the forest was silent again. "We need to get back to the road," I whispered. "Find help." Sarah nodded, and we started moving again, keeping low and quiet. It was slow going, every step careful. The forest was dark and confusing, but eventually, we found our way back to the road. We stayed hidden at the edge, watching for the car. After a few minutes, I saw headlights in the distance. I waited, my heart in my throat. The car passed without slowing down. It wasn't him. We ran to the road, waving our arms. The next car slowed down, and I explained what had happened. The driver, an older man, let us in and drove us to the nearest town. We went straight to the police, telling them everything. The police took our statements and sent out a patrol to look for the man. We never heard back about what happened. Sarah was reunited with her family, and I continued my trip, though I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my chest. Every time I drive at night now, I'm more careful. I watch my mirrors, and I never pick up strangers. The memory of that night stays with me, a reminder of how quickly things can go from normal to terrifying. I had been on the road for about 12 hours, driving through the deep south, trying to make good time on my delivery route. The night was dark and the highway stretched out in front of me, empty except for the occasional car passing by. I was tired, but I had a few more hours to go before I could stop and rest. I pulled into a rest stop to stretch my legs and get a cup of coffee. The place was nearly deserted, just a couple of trucks parked and a few cars. I got my coffee and stood by my truck, enjoying the cool night air. A truck pulled up next to mine, and a man got out. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a friendly smile and a worn trucker cap. He waved and walked over. "Hey there, need a break too?" he said. "Yeah, been a long day," I replied. He introduced himself as Dave and started chatting about the road, the weather, the usual stuff. He seemed nice enough, and it was good to have someone to talk to for a bit. We talked for a while, and he offered me a soda from his truck. "Thanks, but I just got coffee," I said. "Suit yourself," he said, smiling. After a while, I said I needed to get back on the road. Dave nodded and wished me safe travels. I got back in my truck, feeling a bit more awake after the break. I pulled out of the rest stop and continued down the highway. It wasn't long before I noticed headlights behind me, closer than they should be. I checked my mirrors and saw it was Dave's truck. He must have left right after me, I thought. But then he started tailgating, his headlights bright in my mirrors. I sped up a bit, hoping he'd back off, but he stayed right on my tail. My heart started to race. Something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it and focus on the road, but he kept following, too close for comfort. I decided to take the next exit, hoping he'd keep going straight. I signaled and took the exit ramp, but he followed. Panic started to set in. I needed to find a safe place to stop and figure out what to do. I saw a gas station up ahead, brightly lit and open. I pulled in, parked close to the entrance, and ran inside. The clerk looked up, surprised to see someone rushing in. "Can I help you?" he asked. "There's a guy following me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I stay here for a bit?" The clerk nodded, and I stayed near the counter, watching through the window. Dave's truck pulled into the parking lot and stopped. He didn't get out, just sat there, his headlights aimed at the store. I could feel my hands shaking. What did he want? Why was he following me? I tried to think of what to do. The clerk came over, looking concerned. "You want me to call the cops?" he asked. "Yes, please," I said. The clerk picked up the phone and started dialing. I kept watching the truck, my heart pounding. After a few minutes, Dave got out and walked towards the store. I felt a surge of fear and backed away from the door. He came in, his smile gone. "Hey, why'd you run off like that?" he asked, his voice too casual. "I don't know you," I said, trying to sound firm. "Leave me alone." "Come on, we were just talking," he said, stepping closer. The clerk hung up the phone and came around the counter. "Sir, you need to leave," he said. Dave glared at him, then back at me. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We were getting along fine." I said leave her alone, the clerk repeated. Dave stared at us for a moment, then turned and walked out. He got back in his truck and drove off. I watched until his taillights disappeared, my whole body shaking with relief. The clerk stayed with me until the police arrived. I told them everything, and they took my statement. They said they'd keep an eye out for Dave's truck, but there wasn't much they could do unless he came back. I thanked the clerk for his help and got back in my truck, still feeling shaky but determined to get back on the road. I drove to the next town and found a well-lit parking lot to sleep in, where I hoped I'd be safe. That night was one of the longest of my life. I kept waking up, checking the mirrors, expecting to see those headlights again. But they never came. The next morning, I got back on the road, still feeling uneasy but grateful to be okay. I finished my route and made it home safely. But the experience stayed with me. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I never took my safety for granted again. And I always remembered the kindness of that clerk, who helped me when I needed it most. That night I was driving through the Canadian wilderness, transporting goods from one remote town to another. The trees stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. It was just me, the truck, and the vast expanse of forest. I was starting to feel the fatigue set in when I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road. The hood was up, and there was a man standing next to it, waving me down. I hesitated for a moment but decided to stop. It was getting dark, and it didn't feel right to leave someone stranded out here. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need some help?" I called out. The man jogged over, looking relieved. "Thank you. My car broke down, and there's no signal out here. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" He looked harmless enough, maybe in his mid-30s, dressed in a jacket and jeans. I nodded. "Sure, hop in." He grabbed a small backpack from his car and climbed into the passenger seat. As we started driving, he introduced himself as Tom. He seemed friendly, chatting about how he'd been visiting a friend and was now heading back home. I told him about my delivery route and how quiet it usually was. About half an hour into the drive, something started to feel off. Tom was asking a lot of questions, too many, and some that felt a bit too personal. I tried to keep the conversation light, but I was growing uneasy. Suddenly, Tom reached into his backpack and pulled out a gun. "Keep driving," he said, his voice cold. "And don't try anything stupid." My heart pounded in my chest. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay calm. "What do you want?" "Just keep driving," he repeated. "I'll tell you where to go." I did as he said, my mind racing. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity, the sun setting and darkness closing in around us. He directed me to take a turn onto a narrow, unmarked road. It was barely wide enough for the truck, the trees closing in on both sides. "Pull over here," Tom said. I pulled over, the truck coming to a stop in a small clearing. Tom motioned for me to get out. "Leave the keys," he said. I got out of the truck, my legs shaking. Tom followed, the gun still pointed at me. "We're going for a walk," he said, gesturing towards the dense forest. I knew I had to do something, but my mind was blank with fear. As we walked into the woods, I tried to think of a plan. The trees were thick, and the ground was uneven. I stumbled, and Tom pushed me forward, impatient. We walked for about 10 minutes before he stopped. "This is far enough," he said. "Give me your wallet and phone." I handed them over, trying to keep my hands steady. He pocketed them and looked around. "Start digging," he said, tossing me a small shovel from his backpack. I realized with horror what he intended. I had to act fast. My mind raced as I started digging, the cold earth hard and unyielding. Tom watched me, the gun trained on me the whole time. When he glanced away for a moment, I took my chance. I swung the shovel at his legs, knocking him off balance. He fired the gun, the shot echoing through the trees, but it missed. I dropped the shovel and ran, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I tore through the forest, not daring to look back. I could hear Tom cursing and crashing through the underbrush behind me. I ran blindly, my only thought to get away, to survive. I stumbled upon a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The water was icy, but I pushed through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear Tom behind me, but he was getting farther away. I kept running, the forest seeming endless. After what felt like hours, I saw lights through the trees. I stumbled towards them, emerging onto a small dirt road. A car was parked there, its headlights illuminating the path. I ran towards it, waving frantically. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked startled but rolled down her window. "Help," I gasped. "There's a man with a gun, he's trying to kill me." She unlocked the door, and I climbed in, shaking. "We'll get you to the police," she said, her voice calm but urgent. As we drove away, I looked back and saw no sign of Tom. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. The woman drove me to the nearest town, where I reported everything to the police. They took my statement and assured me they'd search for Tom. I spent the night in a small hotel, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the night's events. The police contacted me the next day, saying they found Tom's abandoned car but no sign of him. They promised to keep looking. I finished my delivery route, though it was hard to focus. The experience left me shaken, always looking over my shoulder. I knew I'd never feel truly safe on the road again, but I was grateful to be alive. I was driving through New Mexico late at night, the highway stretching out endlessly before me. The road was deserted, just me and the occasional tumbleweed. I had been driving for hours, my only company the radio and the hum of my car's engine. The loneliness of the highway was both comforting and eerie. It was around midnight when I first noticed the van. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another vehicle on this lonely stretch of road. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the van was staying behind me, matching my speed. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the driver was just heading in the same direction. After another 10 minutes, the van started to get closer. It was subtle at first, just inching forward, but then it sped up, tailgating me aggressively. My heart rate picked up. I tried to stay calm and decided to speed up a bit, putting some distance between us. For a while, it worked. The van fell back, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Then, out of nowhere, the van sped up again, swerving into the lane next to me. It veered dangerously close to my car, almost forcing me off the road. Panic set in. I honked my horn, hoping the driver would back off, but it only seemed to provoke them. The van pulled back for a moment, then sped up and tried to force me off the road again. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. My mind was racing. Why was this happening? I pressed harder on the gas pedal, speeding down the highway. The van matched my speed, sticking close to my bumper. It was a game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the van's headlights glaring back at me. The driver was relentless. I spotted an exit up ahead and decided to take it, hoping to lose the van on the smaller roads. I swerved onto the exit ramp, my tires screeching. The van followed. The exit led to a narrow, winding road. Trees loomed on either side, casting long shadows in my headlights. I sped down the road, the van still behind me. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep driving like this forever. My mind raced with possibilities, but nothing seemed safe. Suddenly, the van accelerated and rammed into the back of my car. My vehicle lurched forward, and I struggled to keep control. The van hit me again, harder this time. I swerved, my car skidding on the pavement. I saw a small dirt road up ahead and took a sharp turn onto it, hoping the van wouldn't be able to follow as easily. The dirt road was rough and bumpy, my car bouncing over rocks and potholes. The van followed, its headlights bobbing in my rearview mirror. I could feel my pulse in my throat, fear gripping me tightly. I couldn't keep this up much longer. Then, I saw it, an old, abandoned gas station just off the road. It was a long shot, but I had no other options. I sped toward it, skidding to a halt in front of the dark building. I jumped out of my car and ran inside, hoping to find a place to hide. The gas station was musty and dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through broken windows. I found a back room and hid behind a dusty shelf, trying to quiet my breathing. I could hear the van's engine outside, followed by the sound of a door slamming. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. The footsteps entered the gas station, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound of glass crunching underfoot sent shivers down my spine. The person was getting closer. I closed my eyes, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped just outside the room where I was hiding. I could hear the person breathing, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. They stood there for what felt like an eternity before moving on. I waited, counting the seconds, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I emerged from my hiding spot, creeping towards the front of the gas station. I peered through a crack in the wall and saw the van still parked outside. The driver was nowhere to be seen. My car was a few yards away, and I knew I had to make a run for it. I took a deep breath and bolted for my car. My feet pounded on the gravel, and I threw open the door, jumping inside. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the lot. Just as I thought I was in the clear, the van roared to life. It came barreling toward me, but I didn't look back. I sped down the dirt road, heading back to the highway. The van followed, but I was determined to get away. I reached the main road and floored it, my car's engine straining. The van was still behind me, but I saw headlights in the distance, another vehicle. I honked my horn and flashed my lights, trying to get their attention. The other car slowed down, and I sped past them. The van hesitated for a moment before turning off down a side road, disappearing into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking. I called the police and reported everything, but I knew they wouldn't find the van or its driver. I sat in my car, trying to calm down, grateful to be alive. The memory of that night still haunts me. I can't drive down a lonely highway without looking over my shoulder, fearing the van will reappear. I don't know who the driver was or why they targeted me, but I'm just thankful I managed to escape. I was driving through the Midwest on a long haul, just me and my truck. The roads were quiet, and the fields stretched out endlessly on either side. I had a delivery to make, and I was ahead of schedule, so I wasn't in any rush. The peace and quiet were nice for a change. I stopped at a small truck stop to get some food and stretch my legs. The place was almost empty, just a couple of other truckers and the cashier who barely looked up as I walked in. I grabbed a sandwich and a coffee, then headed back to my truck. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a small puddle of liquid under the engine. At first, I thought it was just water, but when I looked closer, I saw it was oil. My truck never leaked oil before, so I knew something was wrong. I got down on my hands and knees to get a better look and saw that the oil filter was loose, almost like someone had tampered with it. I tightened the filter, wiped my hands on a rag, and stood up, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got back in my truck and drove off, keeping a close eye on the rearview mirrors. As I drove, the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I glanced in the mirrors every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. It wasn't until I was a few miles down the road that I noticed an old, beat-up sedan that seemed to be keeping pace with me. It stayed a few car lengths behind, never getting too close but never falling back either. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was heading in the same direction. But as the miles ticked by, the sedan stayed with me, and my unease turned into fear. I took an exit onto a smaller road, hoping to lose them, but the sedan followed. I decided to test them. I took another turn, then another, making a sort of circle back to the main road. The sedan mirrored every turn. I knew then that this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was following me, and they knew exactly where I was going. I picked up my phone and called my dispatcher, telling them what was happening. They advised me to head to the nearest town and find a police station. I agreed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be that simple. As I neared the town, the sedan fell back, then disappeared entirely. I felt a brief moment of relief, thinking maybe they had given up. I drove into the town and pulled into a gas station, figuring I could at least fill up and get my bearings. I went inside to pay, keeping an eye on the pumps through the window. That's when I saw the sedan again, parked across the street. The driver, a man in a baseball cap, was leaning against the car, staring right at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I paid for my gas and hurried back to my truck, deciding to head straight for the police station. As I pulled out of the gas station, the sedan followed again, this time staying closer. I could see the driver's face in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable but menacing. I drove through the town, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. The police station was just a few blocks away. I could see the building up ahead, but as I neared it, the sedan suddenly sped up and rammed into the back of my truck. The impact jolted me forward, and I struggled to keep control. The sedan rammed me again, harder this time. I veered to the side of the road, coming to a stop just a few yards from the police station. I jumped out of the truck and ran towards the station, yelling for help. 2 officers came running out, and I pointed towards the sedan, which had stopped a short distance away. The driver was just sitting there, watching. One of the officers approached the car, but before he could get close, the sedan sped off, tires screeching. The police took my statement and assured me they would look into it, but I could tell they were skeptical. They said they would have patrols keep an eye out for the sedan, but I knew that wasn't enough. Whoever was following me knew too much about my route and my truck. This wasn't random. I stayed in town that night, parking my truck in a well-lit area near the police station. I barely slept, every noise making me jump. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to get back on the road. I had a delivery to make, and I couldn't let fear stop me. I checked my truck thoroughly before leaving, making sure everything was in order. As I pulled out of town, I kept an eye on the mirrors, half expecting to see the sedan again. The road was empty, and for a while, I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But as I drove through a more remote area, I saw the sedan again in the distance, closing in fast. My heart raced, and I pushed the gas pedal harder, trying to put some distance between us. The sedan matched my speed, staying right on my tail. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed a plan. Up ahead, I saw a rest area and decided to take a chance. I swerved into the rest area and pulled up alongside a row of parked trucks. I jumped out and ran towards a group of truckers who were standing around talking. I told them what was happening, and they quickly formed a circle around me, their size and numbers a deterrent. The sedan pulled into the rest area but stopped a distance away. The driver just sat there, watching us. After a few tense minutes, the sedan turned and sped off. The truckers stayed with me until the police arrived. I gave another statement, and this time the officers took me more seriously. They promised to increase patrols and keep an eye out for the sedan. I thanked the truckers and the police, feeling a bit safer but still on edge. I continued my journey with a police escort for a few miles, just to be safe. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that came up behind me made my heart race, and every shadow seemed threatening. I made my delivery and returned home, but the experience stayed with me. I installed cameras on my truck and took extra precautions on the road. Driving down the coastal route in California was supposed to be a relaxing break from the daily grind. The ocean stretched out on one side, the waves crashing against the shore, while the rugged cliffs rose up on the other. I'd been on the road for hours and needed a break, so I pulled into a small, secluded rest area that overlooked the ocean. There were a few cars parked, but it was mostly empty. I grabbed my water bottle and decided to stretch my legs. The air was fresh, and the view was incredible. I walked down a narrow path that led to a more isolated part of the beach, hoping to find a quiet spot to sit and enjoy the scenery. As I got closer to the beach, I heard voices. At first, I thought it was just another group of travelers, but the tone was off. It was hushed, almost urgent. Curiosity got the better of me, so I moved closer, keeping to the shadows. I saw them then, a group of men and women, about 6 or 7 of them. They were gathered around a couple of large vans parked near the cliff edge. There were other people with them, too, but these ones looked different. They were huddled together, looking scared and disheveled. It didn't take long to realize what was happening. My heart pounded as the realization hit me. These people were being trafficked. I wanted to help, but I didn't know what to do. I had no signal on my phone, and I was outnumbered. I took a step back, trying to figure out a plan, but the crunch of gravel under my foot gave me away. One of the men looked up and saw me. He shouted something to the others, and they all turned to look. Panic surged through me as they started walking toward me. I turned and ran back up the path toward my car, but I could hear them closing in behind me. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I managed to get the door open and jumped inside, locking it just as they reached me. They banged on the windows, shouting at me to get out. I started the engine and peeled out of the rest area, the tires kicking up gravel. I drove as fast as I could, my heart racing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see them following me, but there was nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd escaped, but then I saw it, a black SUV in the distance, coming up fast. I pushed the gas pedal harder, but the SUV kept gaining on me. I knew I couldn't outrun them. I needed to find help. Up ahead, I saw a sign for a small town. I took the exit and sped toward it, hoping to find a police station or at least some people. The town was small and quiet, but I saw a diner with a few cars parked outside. I pulled into the lot and ran inside, shouting for help. The people inside looked up, startled. I quickly explained what was happening, and the manager called the police. The SUV pulled into the lot, and the men got out, but they stopped when they saw the people inside the diner. The police arrived within minutes, and the men tried to leave, but it was too late. The officers blocked their way and took them into custody. I gave my statement, telling the police everything I'd seen. They assured me that they would take care of it and get those people the help they needed. I stayed in the town that night, too shaken to continue my journey. The next day, I drove home, unable to shake the images from my mind. I kept thinking about those people, how scared they looked, and how close I'd come to being silenced. I knew I'd done the right thing by getting help, but the whole experience left me rattled. It's been a few months now, and I still think about it. Every time I see a van or an SUV on the road, I feel a pang of fear. I'm more cautious when I travel, always aware of my surroundings. I've installed a dash cam in my car and always make sure I have a way to call for help. I was driving alone in the outskirts of Las Vegas, the city lights fading behind me as I headed towards the empty desert. The road stretched out ahead, dark and desolate, with nothing but the occasional cactus and tumbleweed for company. It was late, and I was tired, but I wanted to make it to my destination before calling it a night. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another traveler on the road. But then the car got closer, tailgating me and flashing its high beams. I frowned, wondering why they were driving so aggressively. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead. But the car didn't let up, swerving dangerously close to my bumper and then falling back again. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, realizing that this was no ordinary driver. They were deliberately trying to intimidate me. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't going to give up easily. I had to do something before they caused an accident. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call the police. But I didn't want to take my eyes off the road for even a second. Instead, I focused on staying calm and getting away from the other car. I saw it turn off up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the desert. Without thinking, I veered off the highway and onto the rough terrain. The car followed, its headlights bobbing over the bumps and dips in the road. I pushed my car to its limits, weaving through the desert landscape in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how fast I drove or how many twists and turns I made, the other car stayed right behind me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the driver's face, illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. They were wearing a ski mask, their eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just trying to scare me, they meant to do me harm. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized I was in a fight for my life. I had to outsmart my pursuer and find a way to get help. But out here in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, that seemed like an impossible task. I spotted a cluster of rocks up ahead, a potential hiding spot where I could make a stand. I slowed down, waiting until the last possible moment before swerving off the road and ducking behind the boulders. The other car screeched to a halt behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. I held my breath, waiting for them to find me. But seconds ticked by, and there was no sign of movement. I risked a glance around the edge of the rock, my heart pounding in my chest. The other car was parked a few yards away, its engine idling. But there was no sign of the driver. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, they would find me, and then I would be defenseless. I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and shining it towards the other car. I didn't see anyone inside, but that didn't mean they weren't out there, waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rocks, keeping the flashlight trained on the other car. I moved slowly, my senses on high alert, ready for anything. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, the crunch of gravel underfoot. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them, the driver, emerging from the shadows with a knife in their hand. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. But before I could react, they lunged at me, the glint of the blade flashing in the moonlight. Instinct took over, and I dodged out of the way, feeling the rush of air as the knife sliced through the space where I had been standing. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought back, swinging the flashlight like a weapon and aiming for their head. There was a sickening thud as the flashlight connected with their skull, and they stumbled backwards, dazed. I didn't hesitate. I ran, my feet pounding against the hard desert ground as I sprinted towards my car. I could hear them behind me, cursing and shouting threats. But I didn't look back. I reached my car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of the dirt road, leaving the other car and its driver far behind me. As I drove, my hand shook on the wheel, and tears streamed down my face. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the nearest town, where I called the police and reported what had happened. They promised to investigate, but I knew it would be hard to find someone in the vast expanse of the desert. I never found out who was chasing me that night, or why they had targeted me. But I'll never forget the terror I felt as I fought for my life in the middle of the desert, with no one around to help.